Okay, tonight I will probably be doing a lot of screen sharing so that you can see, hopefully, what I'm seeing. What I want to do is, we're on the last lap here with workbook 2, which is the 7 bowls of wrath. And that shouldn't take too long to cover. But what I wanted to do before we go through those 7 bowls, maybe we can get to the next week. I do intend to have them wrapped up before Sukkot for sure, before we start a new reading cycle. But we've been talking over the last couple of years about different tools, Bible study tools that we can use, research tools, applying rules of hermeneutics, because when we apply the rules of hermeneutics, which basically means how you study a text, it doesn't have to be a biblical text. I had to take hermeneutics to be able to study secular texts for my doctorate. So it doesn't matter which kind of text you're trying to read, unless it's fiction, of course. If you're trying to read something where you're fact-checking, where you're assembling facts, where you're trying to think empirically, it's important that you apply some basic rules. And that's why it's always good if you haven't had a class maybe in logic or logical fallacies. It gives you a method of thinking about the incoming information and reading it critically. And normally when Americans, at least, hear criticism, they think that's a bad word. But not in the world of scholarship. In the world of scholarship, criticism is a good word because it means we're applying fair weights and measures when we critique a text. We're trying to judge what we're reading in a very fair way according to certain rules. And we know that historically, the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament have not always been read as critically as they should be, because there are certain problems that you learn about when you learn to study hermeneutics that can introduce into your understanding as you're trying to figure out, what does this mean? What does this signify? What is this saying to me personally? If the filter is already distorted, then obviously the textual criticism is also going to be distorted. What you come away with is also going to be distorted. And so sometimes knowing a little bit about those rules is more dangerous than knowing nothing about them, quite honestly. For instance, here recently we had a guy who stole an airplane. And he could get the airplane up in the air, but he didn't know how to get it down. And I'm not laughing at the predicament because the end was quite terrifying, I'm sure. But with hermeneutics, we can make that analogy. If you know a little bit about the rules of interpreting a text, you might be able to get the airplane off the ground, but it doesn't mean you're going to be able to land it safely. And that's why when you study a text, you do have to study it for yourself, but you also have to be aware of what other intelligent people have said about the same text. Our problem sometimes is if a large number of those people, their perception has also been colored about the text. We can have problems if we go in with preconceived ideas about, say, a people group of scripture, and what I have in mind is the Pharisees. Because as we've looked through the book of Revelation in workbook 2, we've seen specific examples of teachings or mindsets that we can specifically assign to the Pharisees. And they weren't all bad. In fact, some of them are very good. We know that it's because of the Pharisees that we have the doctrine of the resurrection. they put that doctrine in place by the first century, along with, we might say they're even one doctrine, but maybe they're two. Not just the doctrine of the resurrection, but that you're going to be resurrected to judgment, that there will be an accounting and a reckoning at the end of your days. And so without that whole ethos within the first century, then a lot of the conversations taking place in the Gospels, and maybe even some things we're reading about in the book of Revelation, will lose context. We'll completely lose the handle on the context because we will not understand in that day and time, in the first century, what did it mean to them when they used this phrase. And I think we've gone over before some strange dialogues that Yeshua seemed to have. And sometimes it would say with the Pharisees, sometimes it would say with the Jews. And our problem is we don't know which ones he was talking about. And for the most part, readers of the New Testament don't know enough about the sects of Judaism. There were many Judaisms of the first century because we don't know the context of what they believed or what they didn't believe, or their alliance with one another or their animosity toward one another. We completely lose the sense of what he's saying, and we start assigning beliefs or stereotypes to the wrong people. So I'm going to give you an example, and we've done this one before in class. It comes from Revelation 3:9, where he says, "Behold, I will cause the synagogue of Satan, who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet and make them know that I have loved you." All right, that's not the only time he says that. He says something very similar again in Revelation. And so the phrase there is synagogue of Satan. Now, if we've fallen into stereotypes or even ethnocentricity, we'll even talk about what that is, then we might be led to believe that all synagogues are of Satan. Do you think everyone's ever drawn that conclusion from that text? Absolutely. I've heard it myself. So that's a fairly common misconception. But what did the synagogue of Satan or the seed of Satan mean in the first century, and to which group was it applied? Well, in order to know that, you have to know that within the group of the Pharisees, who were constantly squaring off against the Sadducees, because the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They thought when you were dead, therefore there was no judgment, there was no accounting. But even within the group of the Pharisees, who all believed in the resurrection of the dead, there was radical difference between their interpretations of the law. And so it was not uncommon for the students from the house of Hillel to refer to the students from the house of Shammai. And remember, the Apostle Paul was from the house of Hillel. And it was not uncommon for them to refer to them as the seed of Satan. And remember, their differences were so sharp, it's not likely, unless they were in a real pinch, that they would worship in one another's synagogues, because they had differences in the way that they did the prayers and so forth. And so if you're from the house of Hillel and you're walking by the synagogue of the house of Shammai, then in your mind, you're walking by the house of the synagogue of Satan. And so in that time period, it has very specific context. And what is the main difference between Shammai and Hillel, these two houses of the Pharisees? Well, other than we can say in general that Shammai was much more severe in his rulings, much more literalist in his rulings than the house of Hillel. Hillel tended to be much more compassionate. We know that they had a very different view of Gentiles. The house of Hillel would welcome the convert, and that's where I kind of want to tie it into Matthew 23. If you have time this week, go back and read completely through Matthew 23, because there are 7, no 8, woes pronounced mainly against the scribes and the Pharisees in Matthew 23. And if you read those 7, no 8, those of you who have been around a while are grinning because you know what I'm talking about, that there is a pattern in scripture where it will give you one number and then it'll say, no, this number, like 3, no 4, 6, no 7, 7, no 8. And it's not like God's forgetting something. Oh yeah, I forgot about that thing. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's showing you something that's true at a more natural level with the first number, and then at a more spiritual number with the second number. So the two are different, but they are the same. And if you look at those last 2 woes, the 7th and the 8th woes against the Pharisees, they really are one, because they're both referring to tombs. So if we look at these 7 bowls of wrath, and this is what I mean about you might be able to get the plane in the air, but there's no guarantee you can land it. If you look at these 7 bowls of wrath, the temptation might be to match them to the 7 woes against the Pharisees and the scribes. Because we know that John is referring to the house of Shammai when he talks about the synagogue of Satan. Which brings us back to, what did the house of Shammai believe? Well, they thought that the Gentile had no part in the world to come. So there was no point in making a convert. As you're reading through Matthew 23 and you're reading the woes, there will be one woe that is addressed to Pharisees who will basically cross heaven and earth to go make one convert. And then it says they'll make him twice as much a son of hell as they are. Now, if you don't know there's a difference between the 2 Pharisees, then you assume that all Pharisees thought it was a good idea to go out and make converts from the Gentiles. But you know better. The house of Shammai would never go on a journey to try to recruit Gentile converts. They didn't believe they had a part in the world to come. This is the house that was identified as the seat of Satan, or the synagogue of Satan. And so in that context in the book of Revelation, it makes perfect sense. Because as we're getting to this vision of every nation, tribe, and tongue, it's quite obvious that the house of Hillel was right, Yeshua was right, the prophets were right, the Torah was right, that there was an avenue created for the stranger and the alien to be brought in and welcomed in to the covenant. But for the house of Shammai, this was unimaginable, which goes back to why Yeshua had to overturn the money changers' tables. It had to do with some deception that was going on with the consent of Shammai. Because of a ruling he made, it was kind of okay to deceive the Gentiles and not to make their sacrifices for them, but to go ahead and take their money. So as you're going through those woes, in some of them you can tell from context which house of the Pharisees he might be addressing. But the temptation at that point, again, is if we've always been conditioned to stereotype or to be ethnocentric, is that we will slip right into that and say that was all Pharisees that he was talking to, that there's no difference between this Pharisee and that Pharisee. But there is a difference, and that's why I want you to be really careful as you go through these texts in Revelation, whereas we know at times he is rebuking, most specifically the house of Shammai, who would not welcome the Gentile, but that you don't take that one paintbrush and paint everything else that we know about the Jews of the first century, or even the Pharisees of the first century, with that one broad brush. because it'll set you up for a crash landing. But there is some value, I think, at looking at those 7 woes to the scribes and the Pharisees and seeing if you can tell from what you've already learned in class who exactly he might be talking about. Or even within these groups of the Pharisees, which specific ones. And we're going to go over some of that tonight before we wrap up with the 7 bowls, probably next week. So let's see if I can share the screen with you. Am I recording? Yes, okay. Here we go. All right, here's the question. Why did Yeshua have so many conflicts with the Pharisees? Well, here's some examples. Sometimes, like we said in Matthew 23, you're reading a woe against the Pharisees, but you know it couldn't possibly apply to this house. It would have to apply to that house. If you see the word convert, it's not even in the realm of possibility to think that came from the house of Shammai or was directed at the house of Shammai, because they would never go make a convert. So sometimes in the conflicts, what we don't understand is which group of Pharisees he's talking to, but you can figure it out. Once you know what these different groups believed or practiced, in the dialogue or within the context of that scripture, you can decode it and know exactly who he's talking to, and it doesn't have to be confusing anymore, and you don't have to pick one. And pick one, I mean, Pharisees are all bad or Pharisees are all good. The truth is, there were rascals among the Pharisees, just like there's rascals in any church or any modern day synagogue. So the best thing to do is to get at least a working understanding of what any group that's mentioned in Scripture, especially in the Gospels, like the Essenes or the Sadducees, the Pharisees, both houses, the scribes, just to do a little research and make yourself, again, little note cards to summarize what did these groups believe? What did their foundation rest on? For instance, I could ask you these questions and you would know, if you had any background at all in Christianity, you would know exactly which denomination or denominations I might be referring to. So if I were to come up to you and say, do you believe once saved, always saved? Well, you've got a denomination in your head already that you know believes that that's the big question of the day, once saved, always saved. Jews more have an idea of, there's an assumption that you're saved, and therefore their literature is about holiness because you are a saved people. But in Christian denominations, that's a catchphrase. Or if I ask you, do you believe if you're not baptized, are you saved? Right? I can think of a specific denomination where that's the big question. Do you believe in purgatory? Do you believe in speaking in tongues? Do you believe in predestination? You could almost answer those questions with a high school education. You wouldn't really have to know that much about Christian denominations to be able to add a specific denomination behind that. The problem is when we're reading the Gospels, we're not able to do that. So in the same way that a lot of Jews, when they hear the word Christian, they automatically think we're all Catholic, that we're all part of the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, and whatever the Roman Church describes what a Christian is. But we know very well that Catholicism is only a section of Christianity. And there's a whole world of Protestant denominations. And we would, if we came out of one of these other Protestant denominations, then we would never identify ourselves with some of those things within Catholicism. but they don't differentiate. They don't know enough about us to differentiate, but we do the same thing. We don't know enough about first century Judaisms to know the difference. We know that the entire theology of the New Testament scriptures rests on a doctrine of the Pharisees, which is the resurrection of the body and soul, either to eternal punishment or eternal reward. And part of it goes back to, what does a Pharisee mean? It comes from the word parush, which means to make things understandable. And that's what the Pharisees did. They believed in a righteous life, and you could improve that righteous life simply by making the scriptures understandable to everyone, regardless of your birth, your wealth, your social standing, whether you were a Levite, a priest, it didn't matter. Even down to the poorest person, it was a matter of reading the scriptures and being able to understand what they said. So when we think about reading the New Testament, that pretty much encapsulates every message of the Gospels and the letters. It's about the resurrection of the dead and a final judgment, and about a holy life and making that holy life available to everyone. So here's our problems. We're not equipped to differentiate this Jew from that Jew. We're not equipped to understand the difference of the beliefs among like-minded groups, for instance, between Pharisee and Pharisee. Plus, this third one, and it's a problem, which is an inherited scorn for Judaism and therefore Jews in general. And we can trace that back to stereotypes and ethnocentrism. That's a long word, but we'll try to define it. Okay. Let's see. Before I do that, no, we'll go ahead and do that. Here's another problem. If we do have this filter of stereotyping or ethnocentrism, then it's going to affect the way that we read the text, especially if the translator also had that preconceived notion about all Jews. Now here's an example. We know that the Tanakh, what's called the Old Testament, it was not written with punctuation or capital letters. So imagine any text trying to read it without capital letters, punctuation marks, or even spaces to tell you the space between the words. That's the hard part of reading out of a Torah scroll like we have, is it's all pushed together. You have to know where the sentence ends, because there is no period. There is no space between this word and that word. You might get a slight, you would call it a white space difference if you're starting a new Torah portion, or if you're starting a new book of the Torah, but other than that, all the letters are all squished together, and you have to already know what's in there. The Greek text was exactly like that. There was no differentiation between the words. There were no capital letters. There was no punctuation. So it was absolutely up to the translator to figure out, once it comes into a modern language such as English, to figure out where it starts, where it stops, where the emphasis is, and where the commas go. And the commas, can change the whole meaning of the sentence. For instance, this one, I think I've shown you this one before. This is from Luke 16, 13 through 15, and you can see where the little red arrows are. It says, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. So as the English translator, I'm reading the Greek text, and I have the words, but it's up to me where I stick the commas. But where I stick the commas can change the whole meaning of the sentence. The way that, and this is New American Standard, which is pretty standard, it makes it into an appositive. In other words, the phrase between the two commas renames the subject, which is Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, okay, by simply inserting the commas in those two places, what we're reading is that all the Pharisees were lovers of money. And they were all scoffing at him. But who said those commas have to go there? In fact, does it even make sense if we look at the whole context of what we know about the Pharisees? Because we know very well that the Pharisees also did not like greedy people. And let's try that. Let's just take those commas out. Where you see the two red arrows, let's take those commas out and now see what it says. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. In English, that changes the whole meaning. What it tells us is there was a subgroup among the Pharisees, and this subgroup was the Pharisees who were lovers of money and scoffing at him. It doesn't mean that every Pharisee that was alive at the time loved money and scoffed at Yeshua. Does not mean that. And so a lot of times the translator can reinforce the things that we already suspected because we were conditioned to expect those things. So we have to be really careful. Let's see. We could say, honestly, if we're reading the text, that there is a group of Pharisees who were listening to Yeshua at that point, that particular group among the Pharisees did love money, and they did scoff at him. But let's take a modern day application. If we go to any typical church, would you say that among all those people who go to that church, there are a few people there who only go to make the business contacts or to be seen doing the right thing in order to maintain their community standing because they want to be in politics, but they're not really there for the same reason that everyone else is there, which is to worship in the church? Now, why would we expect the Pharisees to be any different from any other religious denomination? In fact, if you ask any typical pastor, they'll tell you that it's a very small percentage of their flock that does the major portion of the work, that truly have that sincerity of heart. So what we want to do is say, okay, let's go back to the first century. This is one of our rules of hermeneutics. We have to look at the historical context in order to understand the people that we're reading about. We know that the Gospels are recording that there are some Pharisees who were money lovers and scoffers. is it possible that the Pharisees themselves did not like this group of people? The Mishnah is the code of Jewish oral law that up until the destruction of the Second Temple had always been passed on orally. But in the Mishnah, not the Talmud continued to be expanded up until the Middle Ages. So that's not the text we want to look at. We want to get a written text that is as close to the period as we can possibly come. And that text is going to be the Mishnah. Even though it's after the destruction of the temple, up until that point, it is passed on orally, and it's going to get us as close as we can possibly come to getting inside the mind of a first century Jew. Now, in the section that teaches us ethics, it's called Pirkei Avot. You may have heard it called the sayings of the fathers, or the ethics of the fathers, or the ethics of the sages. But in Pirkei Avot, we can read exactly what other Pharisees thought about things like being greedy, being arrogant, being stingy. We can find out what normal Pharisaic thought was. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to just take some highlights from Pirkei Avot. So we'll start with the greedy thing, since that's the one we're pointing out. What did a normal Pharisee think about money or greed or being stingy? It says on three things the world stands: on the Torah, on the service, the prayer service, and on acts of loving kindness or charity. Sometimes you have to go back to the Hebrew word. So the normal Pharisee thought, yes, the Torah is important, prayer is important, and acts of loving kindness are important. That was normal. In another place it says, do not be as servants who are serving the master in order to receive a reward. Rather, be as servants who are serving the master not in order to receive a reward. And may the fear of heaven be upon you. So they're saying if you truly fear heaven, then don't work in order to get something back. Right? It's not about acquiring wealth. It's not about being rewarded. Have a different heart in you. Now, are there rewards for serving the king? Absolutely, but most of them are held in trust. They're not administered in this life, because if you are rewarded in this life, then he's not obligated to reward you in the next. He'll say, I already paid you. I would rather have mine held in trust, as much as I could probably use a few thousand right now. That's something to encourage yourself. Okay, the next one. May your home be open wide. May the poor be members of your household. The more flesh, the more worms. The more possessions, the more worry. The more charity, the more peace. In other words, the less you have and the more you give away, the better it's going to be for you. They say the evil eye, the evil inclination, and hatred of the creations remove a person from the world. The evil eye, remember, was stinginess and begrudging other people good things. So being greedy, having the evil eye, the Pharisees themselves are saying can take you out of the world. And they put it in the same category as the evil inclination and hatred of the creations. And part of the creations is human beings. So it's to the normal Pharisee, being greedy is not an acceptable thing. They say, who is rich? The one who's satisfied with what he has, not somebody who's greedy. They say the money of your friend should be as dear to you as your own. Well, if you're as concerned about your friend's money as your own, then you probably can't afford to be greedy or stingy. It says, minimize business and engage in Torah. Be humble of spirit before everyone. Minimize business, engage in Torah. So at this point, we realize we've got the stereotypes of Jews that have been handed down through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years as being money grubbers and greedy and stingy and so forth. But within their earliest writing, what we hear from their side is that these things are not acceptable. And if we were to see a Jewish person that was greedy or stingy or proud or arrogant, that would not be considered the norm. That would not be considered the ideal. The one who says, what is mine is yours, and what is yours, that's a pious person. One who says, what is yours is mine, and what is mine, that's a wicked person. Wow, now it gets down to who is pious and who's wicked. It says there are 4 temperaments among the givers of charity. One who wishes to give, but that others not give. He has an evil eye with respect to others. One who wishes that others give, and he himself not give. He has an evil eye with respect to himself. One who wishes to give, and that others give. That's a pious person. One who wishes not to give, and that others not give, that's a wicked person. So which one is the one that the Pharisees would consider the ideal? The generous person, and one who wants other people to be generous. What about the pride and hypocrisy? Well, that was misspelled. Because in those woes of Matthew 23, the word hypocrite keeps popping up. So would it be fair to say that Yeshua was identifying among the Pharisees? Because the key in there is, as we've been through some of this lesson before, when he says, you, Pharisees, and then he identifies the problem. We could see through the text that he was identifying a specific group among the Pharisees. You Pharisees, not every Pharisee, you Pharisees. And he did that when he had the big discussion with the Sadducees, who did not believe in the resurrection. And we believe that he starts out the dialogue and he's talking, it says, to the Jews who believed, and all of a sudden he's calling them snakes and vipers. But as we're reading the context carefully, we realize now he's talking to people who don't believe in the resurrection. And so when he says you have to figure out who the you is. Because probably the writer of the Gospels would have assumed the same way we do. We assume that everybody knows the same things we know in our generation. But 3 generations from now, they may not know that. You know, most people in the United States today, if I said, hey, thanks for the heads up, they know exactly what that means. But 3 generations from now, that may not make any sense at all. And that's why there's an assumption that we understand the time, the historical context. So what did the Pharisees believe about pride and hypocrisy? Well, they say, be very, very humble in spirit, for the hope of man is worms. We're all going to die. You may as well be humble, because you're going to end up down with the worms no matter how proud you are. They say, don't disparage anyone and don't shun anything. Anything, not one word, 2 things. Basically any person. For you have no man who does not have his hour, and you have no thing that does not have its place. So it's saying, even though, let's take a person who has special needs. Why would you make fun of a person who has special needs? The Pharisees are saying even that person has his place. There's no reason to shun or disparage them. In fact, they may be more righteous than we are in their own way, in a different way. They say one who withholds himself from judging removes from himself enmity, theft, and false oath. One who is nonchalant about giving legal decisions is an imbecile, wicked, and arrogant in spirit. Now, how many times a day on social media do people ring in and render their legal decisions? Well, when you're quick to do that without all the facts, they say that you are an imbecile, wicked, and arrogant in spirit. You're not supposed to be quick to judge, especially without the facts. They say, don't make the Torah into a crown with which to aggrandize yourself, and not into a spade with which to dig into them. And thus Hillel used to say, one who makes use of the crown of learning passes away. From here you learn that anyone who benefits from the words of the Torah removes his life from the world. What does that mean? You're not supposed to use the Torah to make yourself look good or to make yourself wealthy. But when you're using it as a spade, which goes back to every single day, social media, the news media, it doesn't matter where you go, there are people who believe they are taking the righteousness of God, but they're using it to dig with. Either to destroy someone else, to make themselves look better. And when you're doing that, what do they say you're doing? You're removing your life from the world. You're not supposed to use the Torah to make yourself look good. That's not the point of it. It's to make the Father look good. It says, let the honor of your student be dear to you as your own, and the honor of your fellow like the reverence of your teacher, and the reverence of your teacher like the reverence of heaven. So is it our job to point out our friends or our companions' shortcomings? Is it our job to pray like the Pharisee that Yeshua talked about, who in his prayer says, I'm so glad that you didn't make me like this publican over here. See, he's pointing out what they already know. He's upholding what they already know about piety and righteousness and about honoring one another and not being arrogant. They say envy, lust, and coveting honor drive a man from the world. Okay, when Yeshua condemns the people who like the best seats in the synagogues and like to sit with kings, he's affirming what has already been said, that these are not things to covet. That type of honor should not be coveted. It makes you a bad Pharisee if you're doing that. Blessed be he who has before him no wrong, no forgetfulness, no respect of persons, no taking of bribes, for all is his. Right? If you have no respect of persons, it would suggest that you're not arrogant, that you're not proud. It says, don't seek greatness for yourself, and do not covet honor. More than your study, do. And do not desire the tables of kings, since your table is greater than their tables, and your crown is greater than their crowns. Well, that's good to know. Again, that those crowns and tables are waiting for us in the kingdom. So we don't need to covet the honor of human beings. Anyone who has these three things is from the students of Abraham our father, and anyone who has three other things is from the students of Bilam the evildoer. One who has a good eye, that means he's generous, a humble spirit, and a small appetite is from the students of Abraham our father. One who has an evil eye, a haughty spirit, and a broad appetite is from the students of Bilam the evildoer. The students of Bilam the evildoer inherit Gehinnom and go down to the pit of destruction. As it is stated, and you, God, will bring them down to the pit of destruction, the people of blood and deceit. They will not live out half their days, and I will trust in you. And this helps us put some of Yeshua's statements about if Abraham were really your father. Think of that context when he's having an argument with certain Jews. What is he saying from a first century context? That if you're truly a student of Abraham, you're going to be generous, you're going to be humble, and you're going to be in control of your appetites. But if not, if you're stingy, if you're proud, and you're not in control of your appetite, then you're the offspring of Bilam. You're one of his students. It says, 4 classes of people that do not receive the divine presence. A company of scoffers. As it is written, he stretches out his hand with scorners. A company of liars. As it is written, he that speaks falsehood shall not be established before mine eyes. A company of flatterers. As it is written, that a hypocrite cannot come before him. Yeshua addressed all these people because these types of peoples would have been considered deviations from the ideal. The people who were scoffing at him, that said they were lovers of money and they were scorning him, well, they already knew what they were doing was wrong. When he talks about people being liars, they already know that's wrong. When he talks about people who are flatterers and hypocrites, they already know that's wrong. What is he doing? He's upholding the values of the Pharisees. What he is doing is something that we all do. We tend to be more harsh on people within our group than sometimes we are on people outside the group. We tend to be tougher on people of faith than we are on total infidels. And I would say that's probably true. If you did get on social media, and let's just take Hebrew Roots. If you went to Hebrew Roots websites or blogs or Facebook interactions, you're just as likely to see Hebrew Roots people reprimanding other Hebrew Roots people as you are to see them reprimanding politicians and nations and so forth. And there's times you have to wonder, who is their real enemy, because it's hard to tell the difference, because they can say really ugly things. But with Yeshua, when he gives reproof within his group, it's righteous reproof. We can trust him. Let's see, I'm going to take this down because I want to go to something else. Now that we kind of have an idea of what the Pharisees considered the ideal Pharisee, we know that they did. They rebuked their own greedy people. They rebuked their own arrogant people. And the word is supposed to transform Israel into generous people, not stingy ones. The word is supposed to make you a genuine, sincere person, not a hypocrite. But again, if you look back at Matthew 23, from everything we know about the Pharisees, not just in Pirkei Avot, but in other contexts within Scripture, which I want to look at, we know he's not condemning all scribes and Pharisees. he is specifically condemning the groups that he's calling out within the greater group. And because in Acts 21:20, after Yeshua is resurrected, it says, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the Torah. Well, who were the most zealous people for the Torah? Probably the Pharisees and the Essenes. Those were, now the Sadducees were too, but we know they had some real doctrinal issues, and they also had some huge hypocrisy issues in terms of basically being in bed with the Romans to retain control of the temple. And it was very lucrative for the Sadducees to do that. But again, if he says those who call themselves Jews, but they're not, it did have a specific historical context to the house of Shammai because they rejected the Gentile. And in context in Revelation, he's talking about people who have been rejected. And now a certain people are going to have to admit that they're part of the group, that was part of the plan. But we can also say in a more general sense that would have applied to the Sadducees. But again, we take the most specific context and apply it there. Let's take that pattern about pulling one scripture out of its context, because it would seem in certain cases that Yeshua didn't like rich people. He would say, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich person to enter into the kingdom of heaven. We have to take that, just like we do the Pharisees, and say, am I stereotyping rich people? Or am I stereotyping poor people? This can apply to any group. So in James chapter 2, verse 6, it says, is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? Do they not blaspheme the fair name by which you have been called? All right, if we were to pull just that verse out of the book of James, or the letter of James, it would sound as though all rich people are going to oppress you, drag you into court, and blaspheme. But it's just as dangerous to take only one more verse. Let's say the verse about Yeshua saying it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom. What if we took only those two? Could we get the plane off the ground like that and make a blanket statement that says all rich people will oppress us, drag us into court, and blaspheme? We have to take the full context of Scripture, because we have lots of examples of generous, righteous, rich men and women. We have Job, we have Abraham, we have the Queen of Sheba, we have Lydia, we have Joseph of Arimathea, we have the Pharisee Nicodemus, who actually did not consent to Yeshua's death. That court was most likely a kangaroo court assembled by the Sadducees, because they did have control at that time. But there's at least one Pharisee who did not consent to Yeshua's death, and he was very high ranking. So here's a couple of other contexts. It says in Matthew 27:57, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him, and Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb. John 19:39. Nicodemus, who had first come to him by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. So we have wealthy men, high-ranking men, rich men. In these contexts, we don't see them dragging people into court. We don't see them blaspheming. And so we have to keep working. We don't have permission to stop working and simply just take this broad brush that says rich people are bad. We have to say there are contexts for rich people doing good things and doing bad things. We have to know the context, because if we settle for stereotyping, it does remove the burden of being diligent and being a good student. But if you choose not to stereotype, then context is a challenge. It means you have to put together not just the simple meaning of the text, but you have to put together what it meant to the people who spoke the words. So remember, to the Pharisee of the first century, a truly spiritually rich person was the one who was satisfied with what he has. So you could live in a shack, and if you were happy with what you had, they considered you rich. You could live in a mansion, and if you were satisfied with what you had, they would consider you rich. But there's another type of rich person, and this rich person is spiritually deficient because he's greedy and he has a grander view of himself than any honorable Pharisee should have. And we don't find this type of rich person lurking among the first century Pharisees. We find them lurking among the 7 assemblies of Revelation. In Revelation 3:16, it says, because you're warm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and you don't know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. Well, this is kind of a recall of what we read in Pirkei Avot. The understanding is if you're spiritually rich, you're satisfied with your earthly goods. You have need of nothing because you trust in Adonai to meet your needs. But the opposite can be true too. That those who believe they are sufficient in spiritual goods will actually find out that they're very poor. In fact, they need to have a lot more to be considered spiritually rich. Like Yeshua said, they look good on the outside with their acts of piety, but on the inside, it says, it's like dead men's bones. So what can we say about a rich person? This spiritually rich person is going to be content with his earthly goods, but he's never going to cease seeking spiritual riches. The lukewarm man is still a religious person, but he's never going to be content with his earthly goods, and he'll fail to seek the greater spiritual riches of the kingdom. Because it says we can't serve God and money. So for the lukewarm person, he'll find himself enslaved to acquiring more things. And the irony of it's going to be is he thought he was okay. So we do have to be careful about just stereotyping the rich, the poor, the Pharisees. And what is a stereotype? Well, it's an oversimplified opinion or an uncritical judgment. What do we mean by uncritical? We've not applied the facts. We've not applied the rules of hermeneutics. We've been lazy students. That's one attribute of a lazy student. You stereotype, and rather than try to figure out why this text is different from this text, we pick one and say this is what it means, because it's too hard to figure out what was going on with these Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Ebionites and all these other groups. We simply say the Jews. right? Because that's what the Gospels do frequently. It will say the Jews. But see, we don't even understand that the Jews typically applies to the Judeans, not to the Galileans. Yeshua and most of his disciples came from the Galilee. They were a different breed of Jew. The Judeans of the south were, that was a tough group to be with. They were hyper-religious. They were very conscious of ritual purity, very suspicious of the Romans, very likely to start an insurrection. The Galileans were a little more accepting of Rome because they were in Galilee of the nations. They were at crossroads there of trade routes, so they had a lot of interaction with other people. So even knowing a small detail like that, it helps you understand why Peter got spotted so fast while he was waiting for Yeshua's trial to see the outcome of the questioning. It didn't take very long at all. And they said, "Oh, you're a Galilean. You're one of his disciples." And he's like, "No, I'm not." But his words and his accent were giving him away. He obviously was different from a Judean. So what may have been handed down to us was a stereotype that the Gospels are recording a war of Jews against Gentiles, or Christianity against Judaism. And that's not a good inheritance to hold on to. The better inheritance is to do the homework, to be a good student, to figure out how these groups interacted with one another, to try to see them through Yeshua's eyes, through Yeshua's first century eyes. Because most of the conversations that Yeshua had with these Pharisees were part of normal religious debate. In fact, you wouldn't take the transcript of a church meeting, highlight the beliefs of the worst participants at the meeting, and then go tell everyone that what those people said represent the beliefs of the entire church. In fact, the other people present at the meeting would probably object and say, "No, we were not there to agree with them. We were there to rebuke them." And so we can see other examples. For instance, it was the Pharisees who warned Yeshua that Herod was trying to kill him, and he needed to try to get away. We know specifically the Judeans that he was warned against. And so there were times that he would try to avoid them. And there's a whole political, religious history that goes with the Judeans. Let's see. So let's go back to those woes right quick to kind of wrap it up. And then next week we can hopefully get through most of these bowls. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." All right, here's our practice. If he says that these hypocrites are shutting off the kingdom of heaven from people, and they don't want people to go in, then that gives us a clue as to which specific house of the Pharisees he might be addressing, especially hypocrites within that house. Most likely the house of Shammai, because they didn't believe that the Gentiles could enter in. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore, you will receive greater condemnation." All right, this goes back again to the body of law of interpretation of law, especially in the temple period. And if they created laws and statutes that took advantage of widows, it wouldn't have really mattered which house he was addressing, because it would have violated the heart of the Torah, which is for the stranger, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. And so basically he's saying, you're pretenders. If you're using the Torah to take advantage of people, you're just a pretender. And, you make long prayers, but it's just a pretense. In fact, a hypocrite means an actor on a stage. And so we can do our prayers to be seen of people, or we can be sincere in our long prayers. I know my mom sometimes could pray for hours. I'm not kidding you, literally hours. But it was no pretense. She would just close herself up in her room and pray. So a long prayer does not make you a hypocrite. But the heart is going to determine that. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. This tells us most likely he's addressing hypocrites within the house of Hillel, because they would go make converts. He says, woe to you, blind guides, who say whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by both the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. All right, that one is not so clear. But again, it's referring to alterations in Jewish law. And basically, it was chasing your tail. All right, it was minutia, and it had become a burden to the average person to try to figure out how to conduct themselves, at least ritually, because there's debate as to whether it was the Sadducees or the Pharisees, but there is agreement that in the first century, there was an attempt to impose the same ritual purity that had to be observed in the temple itself upon every Jew in every house. And Yeshua seems to be addressing this when he says, you can't even bear this yoke, and you're trying to put it on other people. Ritual purity is for the temple. Family purity is for the home. There's a difference. It's not supposed to be that heavy a burden, but it was just a way to check up on people and to control people. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. All right, in this case, he's upholding the oral law. In number 4, he seems to be questioning some of the foolish things that have grown out of it. In this, he's saying, yes, tithe mint, dill, and cumin, but don't neglect the weightier provisions of the Torah. You can do these things, but don't neglect the others, because it's about the heart. It's about the justice and the mercy and the faithfulness. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. All right, he's being very specific here, and it helps us. He says, you blind Pharisee. He doesn't say all Pharisees are blind. By making his statement specific, he's pointing out specific behaviors among the scribes and the Pharisees that should be reprimanded. Brother to brother, Jew to Jew, or Christian to Christian. It's about with whom do you identify? And he's saying, I'm talking to you blind ones, that you can't do the right thing on the outside, but inside be full of robbery and self-indulgence. Why? Because remember, self-indulgence was one of those sayings in the Pirkei Avot that says you can't be that type of person. And then finally he says, and notice the similarity between 7 and 8. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And then, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets. It goes back to the tombs. And adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you were sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? So basically, again, and I know we've covered this in class before, when you call someone a serpent, what you're saying is that you're twisting the Torah, like the original serpent. What did the serpent come in and do? He took that which had been spoken and he twisted it until what was actually spoken was uncertain. He injected doubt as to the real meaning of the text. When you inject doubt as to the real meaning of the text, especially to further your own purposes, you become a serpent. And so that's why you would hear, let's say, first century language, if you hear two Jews discussing a passage of the Torah, and one disagrees with how this one is interpreting it, he'll say, you're destroying the Torah, you're destroying the Torah. What does that expression mean? Well, he can't literally destroy the Torah. What he's saying is, your interpretation is bad. And in the first century, it was very common if the interpretation or the application was bad to call them the seed of Satan, or serpents, or a brood of vipers. The only reason that we know about this Synagogue of Satan thing is because it's recorded that the house of Hillel referred to a certain rabbi as the seed of Satan, or as being from the synagogue of Satan, because he had 2 wives. And they thought that was an improper application of the Torah, that just because the Torah records polygamy does not mean that it approves of polygamy. And so what was he doing? He was destroying the Torah. He was giving an improper application. And so they called him the seed of Satan. But it gives us context. And Mariella just put something in the chat box. It says there were 7 types of Pharisees. According to the Talmud, 5 were bad, but 2 were good. So it's not as though this group of people did not understand they had their own problems. They did. They spoke into their own problems. It's our responsibility not to read the recording of these problems and say, all the Pharisees were hypocrites. All the Pharisees were stingy. All the rich people were blasphemers. All the rich people wanted to take you to court. It's just, it's getting the airplane in the air, but you can't land it that way. You're going to crash. So you have to do your student work, and sometimes it's not fun. A lesson like this, where you go back and you read the history, unless you're just a history buff, some people are, but unless you're just a history buff, sometimes it's boring to go in and look at the history and say, okay, this is what the Sadducees believed. This was their role in temple history. This is what the Pharisees were. This was their major doctrine. These were the two major houses. These were the disagreements they had within the two houses. These were the Essenes. These were the Ebionites. But if you're willing to do that work, then later in the book of Acts, when Paul proudly proclaims, I am a Pharisee and I am a son of a Pharisee, and he says it like it's a good thing. Now we've got a whole context for why he would proclaim such a thing, and then attach to it that it's because of my belief in the resurrection of the dead that I'm here. We know that that was the great contribution of the Pharisees, was giving a structure to the doctrine of the resurrection and the idea of a judgment to follow. And so, were there rascals among the Pharisees? You betcha. There's always going to be rascals among any religious group. You're going to have some hypocritical Pharisees and some wicked, wow, I could make a new word there. Wicked rich men, wicked rich men. Same way you might have a drinking Baptist. It could happen, but it's probably not recognized as the norm or the ideal. So as we're reading in Revelation, and we do begin to pick up some things here, we say, that sounds like Pharisee language right there. As we get into these woes, and then we kind of match the woes up with the bowls of wrath, we won't have that temptation to start stereotyping. Because trust me, when it's carried into its extreme, people die. It's because of these stereotypes that pogroms, the Holocaust, the Inquisition, and today it just comes under the label of anti-Zionism. There's lots of modern, politically correct labels for it. It's the same old spirit. But we don't have to fall for it.